Welcome to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime, a podcast with real-life mysteries told mindfully and made for uninterrupted nighttime listening. Dead Sleep is 100% independent and ad-free, and I plan to keep it that way. So if you like the show, consider a paid subscription, and rest assured, every single cent goes right back into making this podcast the best it can be. More episodes, more stories, more sleep. You can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Patreon. And if you can't subscribe or you're oversubscribed, I get it. It is a sincere pleasure to create something for you every week, all the same. My name is Nancy Miller. I happen to be a journalist and editor based in LA, but there are probably 5 million other Nancy Millers out there. There's one Nancy Miller in particular who's pretty famous. She's a TV show writer and producer behind shows like The Closer, Any Day Now, and Saving Grace. A lot of people love that Nancy Miller. And I know this because I receive emails and Twitter replies meant for her. My association with that Nancy Miller hasn't had a huge impact on my life, other than feeling bad for the disappointed fans of hers once I have to reveal they have the wrong Nancy Miller. But tonight's story is about what happens when you share a name with someone and the effect on your life is significant. What if sharing the same name with someone wasn't just a little disappointing, but completely destructive? What if someone who shares your name did something really bad, and you're the one who ends up taking the blame? Those are the compelling questions at the center of tonight's episode. A real-life tale of mistaken identity that started in Dallas, Texas, and then spiraled into something out of the Twilight Zone. So with that, let's settle in for the night. Close our eyes, get cozy under those covers, and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime, and a story I'm calling Double Trouble. It was Dallas, Texas, 1980. And in Dallas, Texas in 1980, everybody was talking about one shocking event: a shooting. The victim was a brash and conniving oil tycoon, the patriarch of one of Dallas's wealthiest families. On the evening of March 21st, 1980, he was shot twice by an unknown assailant. And everyone in Texas, in America, all over the world, had just one question. Who shot JR? J.R. Ewing was a fictional TV character on the popular TV series Dallas. And the nighttime soap opera was a global phenomenon. And the series promoted a fantastical image of Dallas and of Texas in the 1980s that was glamorous and moneyed and a life of luxury. This was not the era of quiet luxury. It was loud luxury, rhinestone cowboys in 20-gallon hats. And the ultimate symbol of loud luxury was a touch of mink. Actually, a lot of mink. Fur coats, fur boots, fur everything. On a promotional shot for the series Dallas, there's a picture of J.R. Ewing, played by Larry Hagman, wearing a white cowboy hat and a giant white fur coat. J.R. looks like a very rich, very smug, abominable snowman. No wonder someone wanted to shoot him. The question of who shot JR was an epic cliffhanger, and everybody had to wait an entire summer until the next season of Dallas to find out who did it. There was another shooting that spring. A real shooting in the real Dallas. And in that case, the question of who the shooter was wouldn't be neatly tied up in a bow next season. It was a messy, confounding mystery, one that would take years, over a decade, to solve. May 6th, 1980, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a warm spring day in Dallas. Not exactly fur coat weather, but around this time of year, women and men like J.R. Ewing, who owned fine fur coats, would bring their minks back to the fur shop to be put away in a climate-controlled storage room for the summer. In the early 1980s, a mink coat was worth thousands of dollars. And those fur coats had tags for authenticity, but the coats themselves weren't traceable, which made stealing them much easier than, say, robbing a bank. There were fine fur shops all over Dallas at that time. On that particular day, a shop called Fine Furs by Reuben was the target. The shop was owned by an older married couple named Reuben and Ayla Danziger. The Danzigers were Holocaust survivors, and they'd relocated to Dallas after World War II. The two people who entered the store that day, around 1 o'clock p.m., were described as young, 20 to 30-something African-American women. One wore a pink jogging suit, the other in navy blue. The woman in pink wore sunglasses. Neither one wore masks. The woman in pink carried a gun, a .22 caliber pistol. That particular type of pistol, a .22 caliber, was a beginner's gun, mostly used for hunting small game or target practice. Brandishing that kind of pistol suggested it was for show. Just do what you're told, and nobody gets hurt. The woman in pink pointed her gun at Reuben Danziger as he walked to the back of the store. The woman in blue stayed with his wife, Ayla, near the front of the store. The woman in blue didn't notice that Ayla had secretly pushed the button for the silent alarm. And Ayla pushed down on that button so hard, her fingernails broke off. This silent alarm would alert the authorities. The police would be here any minute. She and Reuben just had to stay calm and stay alive. The gunwoman in pink had other plans. She'd returned to the front of the store with Reuben and pushed him up against a wall. And then, suddenly, a single pop. Reuben fell to the floor. The gunwoman then trained her pistol on Ayla, barking at her to fill those black garbage bags with fur coats right now. After Ayla did what she was told, another pop. The gunwoman had fired a shot at Ayla, but luckily it flew past the woman's head and hit the front window of the store. The gunwoman aimed at Ayla Danziger again. Ayla had mere seconds to save her own life. She'd survived the Holocaust. She'd find a way to survive this. Thinking quickly, she told the women that she didn't need to be shot. She had terminal cancer. She only had a few weeks to live anyway. This was a lie, and she'd prayed the woman with the gun would believe her, maybe show her mercy, and let her live. The gunwoman listened, then paused, then lowered her gun. "Then we'll just let you suffer," she said. Moments later, the women in the garbage bags filled with thousands of dollars of fur were gone, out of the store and into a brown Datsun, their getaway car. Ayla ran to her wounded husband, desperate to save his life. But it was too late. Reuben was gone. Ayla swore she'd get justice. She seared every detail into her memory. What the women wore, what they said, what they did, and, most crucially, what each woman looked like. She swore she'd never forget their faces, and one day she'd make them pay. The two suspects were in the wind. Dallas police did find an important clue 24 hours after the robbery and murder. On May 7th, authorities tracked down the getaway car, that brown Datsun abandoned on the side of the road. These suspects were brazen and also reckless. When the police checked the registration on the vehicle, they discovered the car was a rental. When they looked inside the car, they found a slip of paper, a receipt for that car rental, and the receipt had the name of the person who'd rented the car. And the name on that receipt was Joyce Ann Brown. All they needed to do now was find this Joyce Ann Brown, and they'd have this case cleared in a matter of days. It looked like they already had a head start. A cop who'd worked on the Vice Squad remembered a Joyce Ann Brown. She'd been picked up on a prostitution charge years earlier. It didn't take long for Dallas authorities to dig into police records and find Joyce Ann Brown's picture. She was a black woman, around the same age as their suspects, and her last known address was in Dallas. They dropped a picture of Joyce Ann Brown into a photo lineup for Ayla Danziger to review. Did anyone look familiar? Ayla Danziger recognized the woman instantly. That was her. Not the shooter, but her accomplice in navy blue. The woman she identified was indeed Joyce Ann Brown. So who was this Joyce Ann Brown? Joyce Ann Brown was actually born Joyce Ann Spencer on February 12, 1947. She was born in Will Point in Northeast Texas and raised in Dallas. Her mother, Ruby, was a homemaker, and her father, Sylvester, was a domestic worker. She married a musician named James Brown. Not that James Brown, a different James Brown. But their life together was cut short. 2 years after they were married, her husband was in a local nightclub. A fight broke out, and her husband was shot and killed. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. With her husband gone, Joyce was a young widow and mother with a little girl, 2 stepsons, along with 14 younger brothers and sisters she needed to help support. Joyce only had a high school education, and job prospects were slim. To help make ends meet, she worked part-time as a sex worker. A call girl was the term back then. But that life, it was years ago. By 1980, when that shooting took place, Joyce Ann Brown had a whole new life, one that she was proud of, and a proper job that she enjoyed. Only now, the problem this time wasn't how she made her living. The problem was where she worked. Joyce was a receptionist at Coslow's Furs in Dallas, a fur shop located 3 miles away from Fine Furs by Reuben, which police said made Joyce the perfect accomplice. Joyce would know which shop to hit, when to do it, and which furs were the most valuable to steal. This case was solving itself. All they needed to do now was bring Joyce in. The police sent off a press release about the robbery and the shooting, and that Dallas resident Joyce Ann Brown was wanted for questioning as a person of interest. It was a few days after the robbery and murder, and Joyce Ann Brown was reading the newspaper. It should have been an ordinary day. Getting up, getting her daughter ready for school. In the newspaper, there was an article about the robbery and murder, the cold-blooded killing of a 54-year-old Holocaust survivor and fur shop owner named Reuben Danziger. Joyce stopped reading. She couldn't believe what she saw. She was in the paper. Joyce Ann Brown from Dallas, Texas, and right there, in the paper, it said she was wanted by police for questioning in connection with a robbery and a capital murder. Robbery? Capital murder? Joyce was stunned. Obviously, there'd been a terrible mistake. She had nothing to do with a murder or a robbery. They had the wrong Joyce Ann Brown. She knew there was only one way to clear this up. She'd head right down to that police station explain who she was, that they had the wrong person, and that would be that. Before she went to the police station, she made a few phone calls, including one to her mother, Ruby. When Joyce told her mom her plan, her mother issued a warning. "Don't go down there," she said. "You may not come back." Joyce was smart, and she was confident. And when she met with police, she wasn't worried. Why should she be worried? First of all, she was innocent. Second, if the police checked, she had an airtight alibi to prove it. Koslow's Furs, the fur shop where she worked, had a time clock with a punch card. You punched in when you arrived to work and punched out when you left. Joyce's punch card said she arrived at work at 8:48 a.m. Her punch card said she left for the day at 4:12 p.m. Authorities said this robbery and murder happened around 1 p.m. that day. So they just needed to check her time card, and her boss and coworkers would vouch for her. When the police did check her alibi, her coworkers and boss did indeed vouch for her, except there was one sliver of time that couldn't be accounted for. Sometime around lunchtime, Joyce disappeared for 36 minutes. At least that was how the police saw it. Their scenario went like this. Joyce Ann Brown went to work that morning and punched in. Then, sometime around 1 p.m., she changed out of her professional work clothes and into a navy jogging suit. She slipped out of the store and into her rental car with her accomplice. The pair drove 3 miles to Fine Furs by Reuben, held up the store, killed poor Mr. Danziger, and terrorized Mrs. Danziger. She and her accomplice then made off with the stolen furs. After that, she was, presumably, dropped back off at the fur shop where she worked. She changed back into her work clothes, made a point of being seen, then clocked out later in the afternoon. Her accomplice transported the stolen furs and later abandoned the car. Joyce had no idea what they were talking about. She insisted she was innocent. The police, however, were clear. They had everything they needed to make an arrest: a witness, a weak alibi, and a rental car receipt with her damn name on it. So, Joyce Ann Brown, 33 years old, Dallas resident and devoted mother, was arrested and charged with robbery and capital murder. They took Joyce into custody. Her mother's warning proved to be a chilling prophecy. Don't go down there. You may never come back. One down, one to go. With Joyce Ann Brown in custody, Dallas police were now tasked with finding out who the second woman was, the actual shooter, who wore a pink outfit and sunglasses. Joyce Ann Brown was useless. She kept insisting she was innocent and wasn't spilling anything about her partner in crime. So authorities retraced their steps, starting with the car rental. And this is where things get strange. Investigators discovered the car was rented to a Joyce Ann Brown, but this Joyce was from Denver, not Dallas. And this Joyce had a Colorado driver's license. So authorities discovered there were 2 Joyces, a Denver Joyce Ann Brown and a Dallas Joyce Ann Brown. When authorities tracked down Denver Joyce, they asked if she could confirm. Had she rented a car recently? Yes, she said she had. A brown Datsun. But, she said, she hadn't driven it. She'd lent it to a friend, and honestly, she hadn't seen the car or the friend in days. Denver Joyce gave them her friend's name, Renee Taylor. It turned out this woman, Renee Taylor, lived in Dallas, and no one had seen her since the robbery. This was the break they were looking for. They tracked down where Renee Taylor lived. When Dallas PD searched her apartment, they found a trove of incriminating evidence: a pink jogging outfit, some fur pieces, a .22 caliber revolver, and business cards from Fine Furs by Reuben and Coslow's Fur. Renee Taylor had a rap sheet, and she was wanted in New Mexico as a suspect linked to another robbery of another fur shop, this one in Albuquerque. The case was coming together quickly, but there were a few glaring issues. Their main murder suspect, Renee Taylor, was at large, and authorities had not one, but two possible suspects named Joyce Ann Brown. There was the Dallas Joyce, the one who was in custody back in Texas. And then there was Denver Joyce in Colorado. And Denver Joyce was the one who rented the car and was friends with Renee Taylor. Dallas Joyce had no connection to Renee Taylor. And when the police searched her home, they didn't find anything. No navy blue tracksuit, no evidence of furs, no business cards, no gun. But Dallas Joyce, she was the woman that their witness, Ayla Danziger, immediately picked out of that photo lineup. It was her, Ayla said unequivocally. To move this case forward, authorities would have to choose one of the two Joyces. Which Joyce Ann Brown should they prosecute? They didn't really have strong evidence that either one of the Joyces was actually guilty. They chose the Joyce who looked the most guilty, at least on paper. Dallas Joyce had a prior conviction for prostitution. Dallas Joyce worked at a nearby fur shop. And Dallas Joyce was the woman their sole witness, Mrs. Danziger, could unequivocally identify as one of the women she saw that day. So they went with Joyce Ann Brown from Dallas. And Denver Joyce was free to go. The trial date was set for October 1980, where Joyce would stand trial for her role in the aggravated robbery of Fine Furs by Reuben and the murder of Reuben Danziger. If found guilty, Joyce could spend the rest of her life in prison, even get the death penalty. In the 5 months before her trial, there was still a shred of hope for Joyce Ann Brown. The police were still searching for Renee Taylor, and once they found her, maybe Renee would give up the name of her co-conspirator, part of a plea deal, perhaps, or maybe Renee would tell Dallas authorities that she'd never met Dallas Joyce, that there'd been a mistake. Unfortunately, when the trial started that fall in 1980, Renee Taylor was still on the lam, and she wasn't about to turn herself in. Anyone who knew Joyce Ann Brown from Dallas said she was a good person, honest and kind. One could only hope that the all-white jury would push past any inherent bias and see how flimsy this case really was, that there was no evidence connecting Joyce to the robbery or the murder, that the timeline didn't make any sense. And the only thing that prosecutors had was testimony from the one eyewitness. Mrs. Danziger swore she knew the faces of the women who robbed and killed her husband. Time and time again, even back in 1980, it was recognized that witness testimony was unreliable and weak. A feature story about Joyce's case back in the 80s noted studies that people held at gunpoint tend to focus on the gun itself. Capable of describing the gun in great detail, next after the gun, they tend to focus on the person holding the gun. And in this case, that was Renee Taylor. But Ayla swore she knew this woman's face. Joyce Ann Brown was the accomplice. Prosecutors knew her confidence, her conviction would play well on the stand. And it did. Ayla Danziger, an immigrant and Holocaust survivor, was so overcome with grief that she sobbed uncontrollably on the witness stand during the trial, and at one point looked directly at Joyce Ann Brown and cried, "Why did you do it? You ruined my life, my husband's life, and my life." There was also a second witness. It was one of the oldest courtroom cliches in the book, the revelations of a jailhouse snitch. During the trial, the assistant district attorney introduced their informant, a veteran criminal named Martha Jean Bruce. Martha Bruce was serving several years for attempted murder. Joyce barely knew Martha, and what she did remember about Martha was that she didn't trust her. She was nosy and liked to stir the pot, and yet this woman claimed she and Joyce were friends, and that Joyce had confessed to her when they'd shared a cell together. What Joyce couldn't figure out was how Martha knew so many details that weren't made public, things about the case that even she didn't know, details that only the perpetrators or a prosecutor would know, which suggested that maybe Martha Bruce struck a deal with the district attorney's office, testify against Joyce Ann Brown, and get out of jail free. On the stand, Martha Bruce was asked, under oath, if she'd been coached by the prosecution, or offered a lighter sentence if she testified. To lie would be committing perjury, so Martha had to tell the truth, and she swore she wasn't offered any deal. She was here to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Joyce sat in the courtroom throughout her trial, overcome by a sense of doom. She now knew the truth didn't matter. It was all about perception. The woman they put on trial was some other Joyce Ann Brown, a Franken criminal built from scraps of innuendo and lies, and welded together with shameless bigotry. The jury did what Joyce feared most. The jury decided this Joyce Ann Brown presented to them in court was guilty. A veteran court reporter would later say it was one of the weakest cases and harshest convictions he'd ever seen in his 20-year career. Dallas Joyce was sentenced to life in prison, and for that, she was lucky. 11 of the 12 jurors wanted even harsher punishment. If that one juror hadn't held out, Joyce would have been sentenced to death, which could have led to Joyce Ann Brown being the first woman executed in the state of Texas since 1863. That woman, the one executed back in 1863, her name was Josefa Chipita Rodriguez. She was also tried for robbery and murder and found guilty and hanged. And for what it's worth, all these years later, history has proven that Chipita, she was likely innocent and didn't get a fair trial either. It was now spring, 1981. Almost exactly a year after the robbery and murder of Ruben Danziger, and around 6 months since Joyce's conviction. A heavily pregnant Renee Michelle Taylor was in a hospital giving birth to a child when she was arrested. She was shackled to the hospital bed, and while in postnatal recovery, she somehow managed to slip out of the leg chains and escaped while her guard was in the restroom. She took the guard's purse, containing a salary check, and left her baby behind. But she didn't last long. Renee was captured when she tried to cash the check at a department store. This was bad news for Renee, but good news for Joyce. Now with Renee in custody, there was a chance that Renee would tell authorities that Joyce had no part in any of this. Maybe she'd reveal who really did it, and they'd track down that woman, and Joyce could go free. Renee did make a deal. To avoid a trial and the death penalty, she confessed to the robbery and the murder of Ruben Danziger, and she received a life sentence. But she wasn't about to snitch on her accomplice. Yes, there was a woman with her on the day of the robbery, but who it was, she wouldn't say. Renee, however, did tell authorities that she didn't know this Joyce Ann Brown, and Joyce Ann Brown wasn't her accomplice. So now everybody knew. Dallas authorities, the district attorney, the judge, they all knew Joyce Ann Brown was likely innocent. And well, it was a real shame, but they weren't planning to do anything about it. Yes, it sucked that an innocent woman was in prison, but the trial had been fair. The jury had made their decision, and they had no plans to reopen this case. She's guilty of something, one lawyer told a Dallas journalist, off the record. Everybody's guilty of something. What's it like to spend your life in prison for something you didn't do? For Joyce Ann Brown, she made a promise to herself that she would stay alive. She would fight for her innocence or die trying. In 1984, she filed for an appeal, citing prosecutorial misconduct. But the appeal was rejected. The only other shot she had at another appeal was new evidence. It wasn't enough just to prove she didn't do it. She had to take it a step further and find out who did. The years passed, and with each passing day was the reality that she was running out of options. 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987. Joyce was still there. On the horizon was the possibility of parole. In the year 2000. And that was just a parole hearing. A lifer getting out of prison early, in just 20 years, the odds weren't in her favor. And she couldn't wait until the year 2000 anyway. After a while, she had to find a new coping mechanism. She was so stressed, so angry, there was really only one escape. When she wasn't working in the prison, any free time she had, she just slept. Sometimes 14 hours a day. Because when she was asleep, time passed. And when she was asleep, she could dream about her daughter, who was 11 when Joyce was arrested back in 1980 and was now, in 1987, on the verge of adulthood. Maybe Joyce hoped that if she slept long enough, it would be like Sleeping Beauty, and that someday, somehow, someone would come along and come to her rescue. In the fairy tale bedtime stories like Sleeping Beauty, that role fell on Prince Charming, and it took 100 years. Joyce didn't have that long. Jim McCluskey was no Prince Charming. A reporter once described him as a hard-driving, hard-talking bulldog of a man. He was the founder of the New Jersey-based organization called Centurion Ministries. Centurion Ministries was the first nonprofit dedicated to helping the wrongfully convicted. They'd heard about Joyce Ann Brown's case from someone in law enforcement who believed Joyce was innocent and wanted someone to do something about it. Jim and a fellow investigator named Richard Reyna met with Joyce. There had been a few journalists who had taken on Joyce Ann Brown's case, notably a reporter named Steve McGonigal at the Dallas Morning News. But so far, there hadn't been a proper re-investigation of Joyce's case. And this is where Jim and Richard came in. When they heard her story, they believed her. And they were determined to get to the bottom of all of this. A process that would take nearly 2 years. There was a lot of important work to do. First up was meeting with Renee Taylor, who was now a few years into her life sentence for Reuben's murder. When they met with Renee, they asked if she'd be willing to tell them who her accomplice was that day. Could she give them a name? A hint? Renee refused to give up a name, but she did drop a breadcrumb, a little clue they could follow. In 1978, Renee and an associate, as she put it, robbed a fur shop in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that associate from Albuquerque was the same associate in Dallas. After a little legwork, the associate, Jim learned, was a woman named Lorraine Germany, and in 1989, they tracked down Lorraine, who was sitting in a Colorado prison, convicted on a robbery charge. She agreed to speak with them, likely out of curiosity. When Lorraine walked into the meeting room, a shiver went down Jim's spine. He looked at Richard, his partner, who stared at Lorraine as if he'd seen a ghost. Oh my God. Lorraine Germany looked exactly like Joyce Ann Brown. Not just a resemblance. She and Joyce looked like the same person, a duplicate of each other. It was spooky. When investigators showed Joyce a picture of Lorraine, Joyce was just as stunned. This woman, she said, she has my mouth. She looks exactly like me. So Ayla Danziger was right about the face. Just the wrong person. It was freaky. Joyce had two doppelgangers, like a doppelganger. One woman who had her exact name, and another woman who had her exact same face. What were the odds? The discovery of Lorraine Germany was illuminating for investigators, but not game-changing. There was no way Lorraine was going to admit to being Renee Taylor's accomplice, which meant they didn't have new evidence, concrete evidence that could lead to an appeal. So they tracked down one last person, Martha Bruce, the jailhouse snitch who said Joyce confessed when they shared a cell. When they tracked down Martha's whereabouts, Jim and Richard discovered two important things. That the district attorney granted Martha Bruce early release after all, which suggested she did agree to give the prosecution testimony against Joyce in exchange for a lighter sentence. And even more damning was that before Martha testified against Joyce, she'd been charged with lying to a police officer. If Joyce's lawyers had known about this charge, Martha would have been discredited and banned from taking the witness stand. Prosecutors should have known about Martha lying to a cop. And if they did know, they withheld that background info from Joyce's legal defense team. This was a huge no-no, and just the kind of material they needed to get Joyce's conviction overturned. In November of 1989, the courts ordered Joyce Ann Brown's release based on evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, perjury, and mistaken identity. When Joyce Ann Brown was finally released after more than 9 years in prison, she'd missed nearly a decade of her children's lives. She was in her early 40s and ready to make up for lost time. She wrote a memoir and became a tireless advocate for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. She founded Mothers for the Advancement of Social Systems to help people recently freed from prison successfully navigate life on the outside. And throughout it all, Joyce maintained her optimism and her compassion. As evidence of this, she became friends with one of the jurors from her case, one of the jurors who'd found her guilty. That juror was so upset by what had happened with Joyce Ann Brown's case and the role that he'd played in it. He became a minister for a Dallas congregation that focuses on social justice issues. He and Brown remained lifelong friends and often did public appearances together, bringing attention to the many innocent people who've been wrongfully convicted. During her darkest days in prison, Joyce Ann Brown always said that if she was going to die, she was going to die fighting. Thanks to her tenacity, her integrity, and a handful of people who believed in her and fought for the truth, Joyce Ann Brown died peacefully in 2015 at the age of 68 with her family around her in Texas. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. If you are still awake and want more Dead Sleep, I'm offering a bonus episode for paid subscribers. So if you're into it, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Patreon. I'll be back next week with an all-new true crime story. Until then, nighty-night.